August 1981, the Waldorf Hotel in New York. IBM, the undisputed giant of the mainframe computer industry, unveils a machine that, at first glance, doesn't look like much. A gray metal box, a keyboard, a monochrome monitor. Priced at $1,565, cheaper than almost anything IBM had ever built. But inside that unremarkable-looking box was a hidden decision that almost nobody in that room understood the real weight of, a decision that, in under 4 years, would push the very company that made it out of control of the market it had just created. IBM had decided to build this computer out of off-the-shelf parts and fully published technical documentation, so that anyone, in any garage or small workshop, could understand exactly how the machine worked and build their own version of it. In the short term, this decision was exactly what let the IBM PC become the industry's undisputed standard within months. But in the long term, that same decision opened a door that never closed again, a door through which dozens of other companies, faster and cheaper than IBM itself, walked straight into a market IBM had built from nothing. This is the story of how that happened, how the largest computer company on Earth, in order to move fast, had to break its own rules, and how that rule-breaking built an entirely new industry that would never again belong to IBM. To understand how something like this could happen, you have to go back to a moment when IBM wasn't even sure it should enter this market at all, to a corporate culture that, for decades, had simply never been built for this kind of speed or this kind of openness. By the late 1970s, IBM was the unquestioned giant of mainframe computing, enormous machines costing millions of dollars, requiring dedicated climate-controlled rooms, operated only by specially trained staff. These machines lived in large corporations, universities, and research institutions, not in an ordinary home. At the same time, something else was happening in another corner of the industry that IBM couldn't ignore. Smaller companies like Apple, Tandy, and Commodore were building small, affordable computers that were going directly into small offices and even ordinary homes, and their sales were growing faster every year than the year before. The idea of IBM itself entering this market was deeply unusual within the company's corporate culture. One internal critic summed up the idea with a now-famous line: IBM building a personal computer would be like teaching an elephant to tap dance. IBM typically spent years developing a new product, internal design, lengthy testing, custom-built parts, everything built from scratch and entirely under the company's own control. That culture made sense for building a mainframe meant to run flawlessly for 20 years. But for competing with companies shipping a new product every 6 months, that pace was hopelessly inadequate. Even so, an IBM executive named William C. Lowe pitched the idea of building a personal computer to Frank Carey, IBM's CEO at the time. Carey gave him a month to develop a prototype on a $1,500 budget and a year to bring the finished product to market, a timeline that was, by IBM's usual standards, almost impossible. Lowe was promoted shortly after, and leadership of the project fell to an engineer named Don Estridge, the man who would become the central figure of this story. To meet this almost absurd timeline, Estridge got permission to run the project entirely outside IBM's standard procedures, something closer to an independent skunkworks team hidden inside the company, far from its usual bureaucracy. The project took the code name Chess and was based in Boca Raton, Florida, far from IBM's main headquarters. The initial team was just 12 engineers, later nicknamed, half-jokingly, the Dirty Dozen, each responsible for a piece of the puzzle. Bill Sidney's leading hardware, Jack Sams leading software, Dave Bradley writing interface code, and Mark Dean and Dennis Moeller designing the ISA bus, the very interface that would later let disk drives and printers connect to the computer. But the decision that really changed everything wasn't made in some grand strategy meeting. It came out of raw time pressure, not long-term vision. Estridge's team simply didn't have the time to design every component from scratch, the way IBM always had for its mainframes. So they decided to build the machine out of parts, already available on the open market. The Intel 8088 processor instead of a custom IBM-designed chip, memory and graphics cards from outside suppliers, and for the operating system, instead of writing something from the ground up, a negotiation with a small software company called Microsoft. Picture the working environment of this team, 12 engineers, far from IBM headquarters, without the usual layers of approval and review that any major IBM decision would normally have to pass through. For a company accustomed to reviewing every engineering choice through multiple committees, this kind of freedom was almost unprecedented. Estridge knew the only way to hit that one-year deadline was to let his team operate like a small startup rather than a division of a giant corporation. And that working style, without anyone quite intending it, planted the exact mindset that later led to the open architecture decision. Instead of inventing everything themselves, use whatever already existed and already worked in the market. There's a particular kind of pragmatism that shows up under a deadline like that, not the confident, visionary kind people like to attribute to it after the fact, but a quieter, more exhausted kind. Every week the team spent deciding whether to build a component in-house was a week they didn't have. Buying an off-the-shelf part wasn't a philosophy, it was survival. And that survival instinct, repeated across a dozen small decisions over the course of a single year, added up to something none of them had set out to build. A machine that, almost by accident, any other engineer on Earth could take apart, understand, and rebuild. This approach, later called open architecture, was born out of engineering necessity, not grand strategic insight. But its consequences, both short-term and long-term, ended up dwarfing every deliberate strategic decision IBM had made up to that point. When Estridge's team went looking for an operating system, they first approached Digital Research, the maker of CP/M, the dominant operating system of the era. Negotiations broke down. Digital Research wanted royalties based on sales volume, while IBM wanted a single flat license. Gary Kildall, Digital Research's founder, wouldn't budge on the terms, and IBM walked away from the deal. IBM turned instead to a young entrepreneur named Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft, a company that, at the time, didn't even have an operating system, only programming languages. Rather than admitting Microsoft didn't have what IBM needed, Gates turned to another small company called Seattle Computer Products, where a programmer named Tim Patterson had written a simple operating system with the internal name QDOS, short for Quick and Dirty Operating System, a name that openly admitted just how rough the product was. This operating system, in fact, had never been meant as a commercial product at all. Patterson had written it purely to test one of his own company's internal processor cards. Gates first bought a non-exclusive license to sell this software, without telling Seattle Computer Products, who his real customer actually was, a move that looked, at first glance, like a minor business trick, but whose real significance became clear only later. A few months after that, just before the official unveiling of the IBM PC, Microsoft bought the full rights to the software outright, this time for around $50,000, and renamed it MS-DOS. None of this looked, at the time, like the deal of the century. Microsoft was a company of a few dozen people, mostly known for selling basic interpreters to hobbyist computer makers. IBM's own negotiators, focused on price and delivery schedule, treated the operating system as one more line item to close out quickly so the team could get back to hardware. Nobody on IBM's side seemed to weigh what it would eventually mean that the software running underneath every single program on this new machine would remain something Microsoft, not IBM, actually owned. But the truly decisive detail sat somewhere else entirely, in one clause of the contract that nobody on IBM's team that day fully appreciated. IBM agreed to buy the operating system from Microsoft on a non-exclusive basis. That meant Microsoft still had the right to sell that same operating system to any other company it wanted. In exchange for saving time and money, IBM permanently gave up exclusive ownership of the very thing that would become the heart of every personal computer for the next decade. Nobody in that meeting thought, that day, that this single contract clause would end up worth more than the computer itself. On August 12, 1981, almost exactly 1 year after Project Chess officially began, Don Estridge unveiled the IBM PC, Model 5150, at the Waldorf Hotel. IBM's advertising for the product featured Charlie Chaplin's Little Tramp character, an unexpected image for a heavy, buttoned-up corporate giant now trying to present itself as approachable and likable. The product's success surprised even IBM itself. Sales in the first year alone crossed $1 billion. The term PC quickly became synonymous with any personal computer, regardless of which company had actually built it, an achievement that still holds true today. IBM, a company that only a few years earlier hadn't even been sure it should enter this market, was now the undisputed leader of the personal computer industry. Part of that success came directly from the open architecture decision. Because IBM had published the machine's complete technical documentation, the exact layout of its internal buses, the specifications of every expansion slot, every hardware interface, software companies and peripheral makers were able to build products compatible with the IBM PC extremely quickly. Extra memory cards, new graphics cards, various printers, all from independent manufacturers, all without needing IBM's official permission. This open ecosystem was exactly what turned the IBM PC from a single product into an entire platform. But this openness had one exception, one small component IBM had deliberately kept closed, and that exact component turned out to be where the entire rest of this story began. At the heart of every IBM PC sat a small read-only memory chip called the BIOS, a set of low-level instructions that every time the machine powered on was the very first thing to run before any program or operating system. The BIOS was what told the computer how to talk to the keyboard, the display, and the disk drives. Unlike almost every other component in this machine, the BIOS had been written entirely from scratch by IBM's own engineers, and IBM held onto the copyright for that code for itself. IBM's strategy was clear. If the rest of the machine was built from open, publicly available parts, at least this one small but critical piece of code would remain under IBM's complete control. Any company that wanted to build an IBM-compatible computer would either need a license from IBM or would have to write an entirely new BIOS of its own, something that, from IBM's point of view, looked practically impossible, since anyone who read and copied IBM's BIOS code would be directly committing copyright infringement and could be sued for it. IBM believed this one small component was enough to keep control of the entire PC market in its own hands forever. That belief turned out to be badly wrong in under 2 years. In 1982, a handful of small companies started building computers they claimed were compatible with the IBM PC. Some of them, like Eagle Computer, simply copied IBM's BIOS code directly and exactly as IBM had anticipated, were quickly hit with lawsuits and forced to back down. IBM's strategy appeared to be working. Without a legal BIOS, no company could truly build a fully compatible machine. But a startup called Compaq, freshly founded by 3 former Texas Instruments engineers, found a different way through. Instead of copying IBM's code, they used a method that would later become known as clean room engineering. The core idea was this. One engineering team studied the behavior of IBM's BIOS purely from the outside. What each instruction did, what result each function call returned, and turned that into a completely neutral technical specification document with no actual code in it at all. That document was then handed to a second, entirely separate team, engineers who had never once seen a single line of IBM's original code, and they, working only from that specification document, wrote the BIOS completely from scratch. Compaq's lawyers had drilled into their engineers in no uncertain terms that the technician writing the code was not allowed to so much as glance at IBM's original BIOS code. One engineer later compared the process to decoding hieroglyphics, because the only thing he had in front of him was a dry technical specification, not a single line of real code. Working carefully and slowly with this method, Compaq wrote an entirely new, fully legal BIOS in just 9 months, one that behaved exactly like IBM's BIOS from a functional standpoint, but shared not a single copied line of code with it. In November 1982, Compaq released the result of that work. The Compaq Portable, a computer roughly the size of a large suitcase, nearly 100% compatible with the IBM PC. IBM sued Compaq and lost. The cleanroom method, exactly as Compaq's lawyers had predicted, turned out to be legally airtight. Compaq, which had expected sales of around $30 million, sold more than $111 million worth in its first year, a figure that surprised even Compaq's own founders. For IBM, that outcome was a genuine psychological blow. A company that thought it had built a solid legal shield around its product now watched a startup with fewer than 100 employees find a way around that exact shield, not by breaking the law, but by following it with meticulous, painstaking precision. It was a bitter lesson. The legal protection IBM had built for itself only guarded against laziness, not against a determined, patient competitor willing to spend 9 full months doing the work properly, from scratch, and entirely within the law. Compaq's courtroom victory proved this was possible, but every small company that wanted to enter the market still had to repeat that same long, expensive cleanroom process from scratch on its own. That was still a serious barrier, until another company, Phoenix Technologies, decided to remove that barrier for good. Phoenix, using the same cleanroom method, wrote its own BIOS, this time with an extra emphasis on legal purity. The engineer who wrote it had never previously worked with Intel family processors at all. He had previously worked on a completely different processor family from Texas Instruments, and was given nothing but a dry technical specification, with no prior background in Intel's architecture whatsoever. That level of legal cleanliness made Phoenix's BIOS practically bulletproof against any challenge. But the decision that truly detonated the market was Phoenix's next move. Rather than using this BIOS only for its own products, the company licensed it to any manufacturer who wanted to build an IBM-compatible computer. Suddenly, any small company, without years of reverse engineering work of its own, could simply buy a fully legal BIOS and walk straight into the PC market. Other companies, like AMI and Award, quickly followed the same path. The result was a flood of IBM-compatible computers that filled the market within a few years. By 1985, you could buy a PC clone with 256 kilobytes of RAM and dual floppy drives for around $1,495, while the equivalent IBM machine cost $2,820. The very open architecture IBM had chosen to reach the market quickly was now being used against it. Competitors didn't need to build an entire ecosystem from scratch. IBM had already handed everyone the blueprint by publishing its own complete technical documentation. The only thing they'd been missing was a legal BIOS, and Phoenix had just removed that last obstacle. From an ordinary consumer's point of view in those years, this price gap made the decision simple. Why pay $2,800 for a genuine IBM machine when another computer, running the exact same software, the exact same programs, with the exact same capabilities, was available for $1,495. For many buyers, the IBM name on the box was no longer worth that price difference. And that was exactly the moment IBM realized that brand and reputation alone were no longer enough in a market it had designed to be completely open in the first place. For a company whose entire identity for decades had rested on the assumption that IBM's name meant something customers would pay a premium for, this was a genuinely disorienting turn of events. Business buyers who had once automatically chosen IBM out of habit and trust now had spreadsheets in front of them showing an identical piece of software running on a machine costing half as much. The premium IBM had always been able to charge, on mainframes and on everything else it had ever sold, simply didn't survive contact with an open architecture and a legal, licensable BIOS. Here's the truly strange part of this story. none of this was the result of theft or any blatant violation of the law. Compaq and Phoenix, working in full compliance with copyright law, built exactly what IBM had believed was legally protected. They never touched a single line of IBM's code. They simply studied how a machine behaved and rebuilt that same behavior from scratch with their own hands. This was, in effect, exactly what IBM, without realizing it, had indirectly allowed them to do, because the PC's completely open, thoroughly documented architecture had, from the very beginning, been precisely the blueprint a rival engineer needed to reconstruct the entire system, minus one small component. And right there sits the real irony of the story. IBM, in order to reach the market quickly, was forced to operate completely in the open, off-the-shelf parts, complete documentation, and a non-exclusive operating system contract with a small company called Microsoft. Each of these decisions, taken on its own, was reasonable, even necessary, for hitting that one-year deadline Frank Carey had set. But the sum of all these seemingly small decisions turned out to be exactly the door through which dozens of other companies walked, a few years later, taking away the very market IBM had built from nothing. By the mid-1980s, clone manufacturers, from Compaq to Dell, which entered the field a bit later, were no longer small, insignificant copycats. They often moved faster than IBM itself, carried lower overhead costs, and could offer prices IBM, with its far heavier corporate structure, struggled to match. The market IBM had once defined was now being run by dozens of different companies, all using the same architecture, the same family of Intel processors, and the same operating system, Microsoft's MS-DOS, the very software IBM never had exclusive control over because of that one contract clause. And in the middle of all this, the company that actually profited the most from this open architecture wasn't IBM, and it wasn't Compaq either, it was Microsoft. Because every new clone maker entering the market still needed an operating system, and Microsoft, thanks to that contract clause that had seemed so unimportant back in Boca Raton, was free to sell MS-DOS to every single one of them. Every IBM-compatible computer sold, whether by IBM itself or by a competitor, likely carried a copy of Microsoft's operating system on it. IBM had built the platform, but Microsoft was the one making money off it, a platform that, by then, no one, not even IBM itself, could control anymore. In the years that followed, IBM never managed to fully regain control of this market. Even its later attempts to build a new, more closed architecture, a standard this time fully under its own control, met widespread industry resistance from a market that had already gotten used to openness and competition. Within a few years, the PC industry had become something no single company could close back up again. Eventually, decades later, in 2005, IBM sold its entire personal computer division, the very business that had begun with Project Chess in Boca Raton, to a Chinese company called Lenovo. The company that had invented this entire industry from nothing had, by then, not been its leader for more than 2 decades. If you had to summarize this story in one sentence, IBM, in order to build a personal computer in a single year, had to abandon its own usual rules, closed design, in-house manufacturing, total control. That exact choice was what let the IBM PC become the global industry standard within a matter of months. But that same choice also opened a door that no company, not even IBM itself, was ever able to close again. Today, when we say PC, we no longer mean one specific product from one specific company. We mean an architecture, a standard, an entire ecosystem of different manufacturers and different suppliers, and an operating system whose roots, even 40 years later, can still be traced back to that one non-exclusive contract Bill Gates signed in 1980. Every computer sitting on your desk or in your bag today, if it runs Windows, ultimately descends from the same open architecture that a 12-person team in Boca Raton, under time pressure and with no long-term strategy in mind, was forced to choose. What's striking is that nobody in that small room in Florida, back in 1980, thought they were founding a global industry. Don Estridge just wanted to deliver a sellable product on time. Bill Gates just wanted to make sure Microsoft, a small company with only a few dozen employees, got as much value as possible out of a contract. Compaq's engineers just wanted to build a competitive product without getting sued. None of these people, in that moment, imagined their decisions would still be shaping the shape of every ordinary computer on every ordinary desk 30 years later. And there's something almost fitting about how this particular story ends, compared to most others like it. Usually a story about a company losing control of its own invention involves a rival stealing something or a leadership team simply failing to notice what they had. This one is different. IBM saw exactly what it was doing at every step. It chose speed over control on purpose, knowing the trade-off, because there was no version of that one-year deadline that allowed for anything else. The company didn't stumble into giving the future away. It made a clear-eyed bet that winning the race to market mattered more than owning every piece of what it built to win that race. And for a few extraordinary years, that bet looked like genius, right up until the moment competitors picked up the very blueprint IBM had handed them and built something IBM could never fully take back. They just wanted to build a computer that would be ready on time. What they ended up building was a market that would never again belong to any single company, not even the one that invented it.